Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Being Patient Brain Talks. I'm Deborah Kahn, founder of Being Patient. Today, we're going to talk about gender differences in the brain. What do we know today? Where is research going to understand these? We all know that Alzheimer's disproportionately impacts women over men. So we're going to dig into some of the basic differences of what we know and what more we need to find out. So joining me today is Lise Eliot. She's from Rosalind Franklin University and studies gender differences of the brain. Lise, thank you so much for joining us and welcome.
Thanks, Deborah. I look forward to talking to you.
Okay, let's start with just talking about the structure of the brain. What do we know about how the structure of the brain in men and women differ?
Well, that's a good question, and I'm happy to say we have plenty of data to answer that question, because since brain imaging was kind of born in the 90s, neuroscientists, not surprisingly, have been very, very curious about that question. So I approached it when I was writing my book, Pink Brain, Blue Brain, and then since then have really dug into the literature and in fact published a few meta-analyses and syntheses on this topic. So here's what we know for sure. Men have larger brains than women. It's about 11% larger on average in large European and North American cohorts. But of course, men are bigger than women. They're usually about 18% heavier or 9% taller. So nobody really thinks that that is meaningful in terms of either cognition or brain health. Um,
So
so,
in this case, size doesn't matter, right?
well, no, I mean, within sex, we do see a correlation between, a weak correlation, I should say, between cognitive measures and brain size. And of course, if there's brain injury, that's going to impair one's cognition. But you really can't compare intelligence across the average man and average woman and say, therefore, men are 11% smarter or something. In fact, there's no difference in IQ scores, and it really depends on what you measure and how you construct the test to see who's going to come out smarter. There are average differences in cognition. Women tend to be stronger in verbal skills, men in spatial skills. But those differences are pretty small. And so there's quite a lot of overlap. You could never predict for any man or woman how strong they are in either of those areas. And what I'm interested in is how those differences emerge, because just because we see this reliable difference in 20 and 30 and 60-year-old men and women doesn't mean we were born that way. Of course, the experience of being a girl and a boy are very different, a man and a woman. And so by the time we measure people in adulthood, you're going to be looking at the cumulative impact of a lot of experience. And that goes for the brain as well.
So let's step back a little bit and talk about that structure of the brain. We know there's many different parts of the brain, gray matter versus white matter. Tell us what the difference is there.
Mm-hmm. So the gray matter are the cells of the brain, the neurons, as well as the dendrites that are like the branches that receive this massive connections from other neurons. The brain is a huge network. So all of that connectivity is happening in the gray matter, but every neuron also has a big wire attached to it known as the axon. And the axons are actually the white matter because they are wrapped in something called myelin, that is a very dense fatty insulator, just like the insulator on your power cable that prevents current from leaking out. You don't get a shock when you touch your power cable. That's what myelin does for our brain. So it's really important for fast and reliable transmission from one part of the brain, one gray matter structure to another. And actually, interestingly, larger brains tend to have proportionally more white matter than smaller brains because they have longer distance to travel, just like a highway needs to be wider. If it's got if the distance from city to suburb is longer, you'll have a wider highway. And that's true for white matter as well.
So do we know how I've heard exercise, you can add gray matter to your hippocampus, at least in animal studies, that's been proven. Um, how much do we have control over the size of our brains and how healthy we make our brains? I mean, obviously, there's external, you can abuse your brain, you can get hit on the head, you can drink excessively, and that's going to impact your brain health. But overall, how do we distinguish nurture versus nature in terms of our brain health?
Yeah, well, assuming, one doesn't have, an inborn, genetic or hormonal deficit, um, I believe that most of what we do with our brain is a function of our experience, learning, health, environment, and so on. I just look at how every healthy child learns language effortlessly without any problem. They become quite fluent by the age of 3 without anybody teaching them. Our brains are learning machines. They are ready to absorb. And so I think that most of the difference in our skills and our reactions are a function of our lifetime experience. You don't read or write or do math problems without a lot of experience.
So, bringing it back to the gender differences, though, are men and the male and female brains, are they wired any differently? I mean, you've said, overall size in general, but that's normal because men generally are bigger than women. So is there a difference in the way our brains function or how they're wired?
Not much, I can say. My research started by focusing on a meta-analysis of individual brain structure. So within the brain, we've got different lobes, we've got different gyri, we've got subcortical structures like the hippocampus that you measured. And one long-standing, I call it rumor in the scientific literature, was that women had larger hippocampi than men proportionally. Whenever you're comparing the size of a brain structure from one person to another, you always have to control for their overall brain size because, we have huge variations in population. So women were thought to have proportionally larger hippocampi, but that turned out to be about a 1% difference and not even statistically significant. And similarly, men were said to have a larger amygdala, which is the emotion center of the brain, also plays a role in face recognition, aggression. I'm not sure, you can take your pick what stereotype you want to associate with that claim, but the truth is that men's amygdala is maybe 1% larger than women on average. So the actual structures don't differ in size between men and women, which is different from some other animals like birds, where you have dramatic differences between the peacock and the peahen, or songbirds where the male sings and the female does not, and you see specific structures that are larger in males and females. We don't have that. I've described the human brain as sexually monomorphic. In fact, I teach medical students brain anatomy, and when we take a donor brain out of formaldehyde, you have no idea whether it's came from a man or a woman. So structurally, there's almost no difference. Functionally, there are claims for sex differences in functional networks. I have to say they have not been very well replicated across large studies. And that may be because there's just so much variation in humans, or because our methods aren't quite as good as we thought they were for measuring functional connectivity. But there is this one network you may have heard of called the default mode network, which is our kind of idle brain when you're not really doing anything and it's sort of the background activity. That seems to be more active in women than men across many studies, but we don't know what that means. Some have speculated that makes women more vigilant, but it really is all speculation at this time. And if you look at the specific networks that do something like language, there really is no difference. We use the same brain areas, the same connections to speak and hear and listen.
So, do we know why more women, I mean, it was previously thought that women just live longer, therefore there's going to be more cases. But now they've proven that wrong, that in fact, women are more susceptible to neurodegenerative disease like Alzheimer's disease. Do we know why?
I really have to interrupt you there because that is not true. The largest epidemiological studies find that the reason more women are diagnosed with Alzheimer's than men is a function of age and longevity. Women live longer, as we all know, and the risk of Alzheimer's does not rise linearly with age. It goes up quite exponentially. So that extra 5 years that women live mean you have just many more women than men in this very highest risk factor category. So there is actually no difference in the incidence or prevalence of Alzheimer's disease between men and women. It is all a function of longevity.
Okay, well,
So
it's really interesting you say that because that's different from what a lot of people in science believe, right? I mean, I thought,
yeah, and I
yeah.
think they do that because I think that there is a lot of grant money out there to focus on women's brains. There's a lot of pharmaceutical companies that want to address women's brain health because yes, twice as many women do live with Alzheimer's than men. It's a very real clinical problem, but it doesn't mean that our brains are innately different or that women are more predisposed. And the other thing is there are so many risk factors associated with dementia that may differ between men and women. And that is depending on what cohort you look at, because, for example, in the oldest generation, men were more educated than women were. And so, that's going to be contributing because we know education provides cognitive reserve, synaptic reserve to prevent Alzheimer's. But as we look at younger and younger cohorts, women are more equally educated, or in the youngest, sometimes more highly educated on average. And you're starting to see some of those ratios differ, gender ratios come down.
So I'm curious about this then. I mean, because what do we know about hormones? Because as it's been explained to me by other people in science, other researchers, that the drop in estrogen has to do with so as women go through menopause, this is how it's been explained to me, so I want you to react to this. But it's been explained to me as women go through menopause, their estrogen drops in different levels of severity, right? As some women fall off a cliff, others it's more gradual. It's when you have experienced a very rapid decrease in estrogen, then your brain becomes more susceptible to something going wrong. What do you have to say with that hypothesis out there?
I would say that correlation doesn't equal causation. Yes, women undergo decline in estrogen, a rapid decline. Men undergo a slower decline in estrogen and testosterone. Remember, we all have estrogen and testosterone. First of all, from the brain side, which is, I'm a neuroscientist, that's what I focus on. I've been looking long and hard to find a convincing effect of estrogen changes on brain structures and networks. And there are a lot of studies out there, but again, they don't seem to be particularly consistent. And there's a lot of effect just on the estrogen will affect blood flow. And so that's thought to be kind of an artifact contaminating those studies. I mean, we do know that women who have difficult menopause transition, who have a lot of hot flashes, and they're not sleeping well, they can undergo a kind of a brain fog, memory difficulties. But that's not all women. That's maybe at most a third of women. So there's tremendous variation among women. And yet if we live long enough, we will all go through menopause. And I'd also like to point out that women live longer than men, probably for a reason. There's anthropologists have developed this grandmother hypothesis that women may have been selected to live longer past our own reproductive age because we provide support for the grandchildren survival. So it would be a pretty crazy brain selection mechanism that would allow women to live longer and yet to decline faster cognitively than men, if we really need to keep our wits about us to gather calories for the grandkids.
Do we know, though, the impact of hormones and the brain I mean, obviously, yes, as we age, we all decrease in testosterone and estrogen. Women have a lot, more estrogen than men. So are there any significant, I mean, how should we look at hormones? Do they need to be researched more, or do you believe that, it's not really a significant piece of the puzzle?
I don't think it's nearly as significant as most people believe. And um, I also think it's not correct that women have more estrogen than men, because testosterone is converted to estrogen, and most of its actions are actually via estrogen, or many of its actions in the brain. So I think if you measure brain levels of estrogen between men and women, I don't believe there's much difference. To me, the most convincing evidence comes at the menopause transition, or late premenopause and into perimenopause, when you have these massive fluctuations and ultimately a pretty steep decline. And that, of course, is what is triggering the symptoms of menopause. And that's where you see the biggest and really the only significant effects on cognition, on things like verbal memory. Once women get past that, the decline is no different. The overall decline is no different between men and women, but they can have this fluctuating and very distressing period right around.
Do we know if those fluctuations have any significant longer term impact?
That's a good question. I don't think that's really been explored that well to look at the relationship. It may have been. That's not really my field. I don't really work on hormones per se, but it's possible. And again, this is a minority of women, and we really do not understand why some women have more dramatic hot flash menopause symptoms than others.
So, in your opinion, should we be studying gender differences in the brain? I mean, is it significant, I guess, to disease prevention?
Well, we absolutely should be studying gender differences, but everything we're talking about so far has been sex differences, right? We take 1,000 men and 1,000 women, we scan their brains, we compare their brains. And so the differences there are pretty subtle, but gender is a whole different story, right? I mean, gender expression is not binary. It's a mosaic within men, within women. And so I've been advocating that rather than using sex as our independent variable, we should use gender as our independent variable. So in other words, score people on measures of masculinity and femininity, expressivity versus agency. And that may give us more clues linking brain structure to function, as well as, some of these neurobehavioral health risks.
So what exactly is your research covering today?
So I'm still very much focused on trying to synthesize the massive literature on brain sex differences. I'm fortunate in that I don't have any skin in the game. I don't have a research grant to look specifically at effects of estrogen on or sex differences in. And so I try to take sort of a neutral observer. But I'm still mostly focused on early development. And in fact, we just did a synthesis with my team on fetal brain sex differences. Now, a certain number of women are getting MRI scans before birth and while pregnant. And so we have several dozen studies that have compared male and female fetal brains. And again, the only reliable significant difference is male fetuses have larger brains than females. Towards the end of gestation, we start seeing them diverge. But again, male babies, newborns are about a half a pound bigger than girls at birth. So we just don't know what the significance of that. And I also like to point out that all the other internal organs are larger in boys and men than women. The heart, the kidney, the liver, and we don't seem to ever talk about that and decide who has the better lungs and kidneys.
So you are actually looking at kind of the physical differences in the structure to determine, what that means in terms of differences.
Yeah, and in early childhood, it's particularly important because we do know that boys and girls have different risks early on. We know boys are likelier to be diagnosed with autism disorder. Actually, many of the neurodevelopmental disorders are more prevalent in boys, a lot of the speech and language difficulties. Whereas, of course, later girls and women are more prone or more likely to be diagnosed with anxiety and depression. So I'm interested in early brain development to see if there are structural and functional reasons to suspect male vulnerability. We know boys are more vulnerable also in other sorts of physical health to, even like sudden infant death syndrome is more common with boys than girls. So something about male vulnerability may be due to the fact that they have only one X chromosome, and whereas females have two.
Well, it's interesting because, starting hopefully with research in early childhood development and identifying what the differences are and how that leads to, one road or another will open the door to more studies about, are there different vulnerabilities in the brain for neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's?
Yeah, my view is that I think we need to just focus more on the lifestyle and preventative factors that we know. I mean, yes, there are genetic predispositions for Alzheimer's. Fortunately, those genes are rather rare. But, physical exercise, social connectedness, cognitive challenge, those are the things that are going to help buffer all of us against neurodegenerative disease, with physical exercise being the most important. And of course, men are generally more physically active than women, so that's probably another factor contributing to some of these gender differences.
Well, Lise Eliot, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your research. We welcome all opinions, and we know with research there are a number of varied opinions out there, but we welcome your point of view and your research as well. Keep us abreast of what goes on in the future. It's a very fascinating topic, so thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So if you missed any of this interview or you want to see more interviews, don't forget to go to beingpatient.com. Sign up for our newsletter. That's where you'll find out what's coming up. Interviews like these. Thanks everyone for watching. We'll see you next time.